Okay, let's just be real for a second. I mean, are you like totally overwhelmed with all the Ukraine war news? It's everywhere, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's like drinking from a fire hose sometimes.
Seriously. But don't worry, today we are not going to be like, rehashing the same old headlines.
Yeah, no doom scrolling here.
Instead, we're going deep, deep, deep into this one specific story.
It's kind of like a case study, you know?
Yeah, and it reveals all these hidden complexities about like the war, international alliances. It's juicy stuff.
So it's really one of those stories that makes you question like everything you thought you knew, especially about like how military aid actually works. You know what I mean?
Totally. And we've got some awesome sources lined up for you today. We've got 2 Economist articles, a really powerful audio clip that takes us straight to the front lines.
Oh, and a Swedish article too, which like adds this whole other dimension to the story.
Yeah, because the fog of war is real, people. It can be super hard to separate fact from fiction, especially in a conflict that's like constantly in the news,
Oh, absolutely. Having those different perspectives is so crucial.
Okay, so picture this. A brand new elite Ukrainian military unit, like top of the line, funded and trained by a major Western power, and it completely falls apart before it even sees any real action.
Talk about a reality check.
Right, and that's the story of the 155th Brigade. This unit was supposed to be like the symbol of NATO support, a model for the future of Ukraine's military.
And we're not talking about some like small scale project here. This was a $900 million investment, like almost $1 billion US.
Whoa, yeah, that's serious money. I mean, that could have equipped like whole battalions with the best gear imaginable.
Exactly. I mean, that just shows you how high the stakes were, right? And how like disastrous the consequences would be if it failed.
And you can just imagine the fanfare when they first announced this brigade, right? It was at the D-Day anniversary ceremony in Normandy, no less.
Oh, wow. Talk about symbolism, right? Like connecting Ukraine's fight for freedom with that historical struggle against tyranny.
Yeah. Photo ops with Macron, promises of a new era of Ukrainian military might. It was like a huge PR win.
I mean, choosing D-Day for the announcement, that wasn't random. They wanted the world to be watching. And it worked. Everyone was hyped.
But wait, there's a twist. It all went south and fast. I'm talking desertions, units getting reassigned, equipment being shuffled around like crazy.
Yeah, and to make matters worse, they threw all these inexperienced soldiers into the most intense combat situations imaginable. Like, just tragic.
And apparently this wasn't just some like one-off thing. It was a pattern. According to Yuri Budasov, who's this Ukrainian journalist, all 7 of the new brigades they raised in 2024 had similar problems when they were deployed.
So it wasn't just bad luck or anything. It points to something way bigger.
Yeah.
Like a systemic issue with Ukraine's military. Yikes.
It's really heartbreaking when you hear stories from soldiers who were there, like Nick, who was a battalion commander in the 155th. He spent months training these recruits, only to have them sent off to different units.
Oh, man. What a waste.
I know, right? And then when the 155th finally gets deployed, it's filled with all these brand new recruits, many of them with 0 combat experience.
That's insane. It's like they learned absolutely nothing from the previous deployments.
So Nick's story is like the perfect example of how disconnected the training is from what's actually happening on the front lines.
Right. Like, what's the point of all that training if they're not prepared for the real deal?
Exactly. He's talking about having to teach these guys basic combat skills while they're literally under enemy fire.
Oh, wow. Learning by doing in the worst way possible.
So let's get to the bottom of this. What exactly went wrong? I mean, how does this supposedly elite brigade with all this money and international support end up such a disaster?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. We gotta like peel back the layers and see what's going on underneath the surface,
Okay, so our sources kind of reveal a few things. One of them is the whole mobilization process in Ukraine. It sounds like a mess. People are getting drafted off the street, even with this new law that was supposed to improve things.
And you've got rising desertions on top of that. Plus this huge disconnect between what the high command thinks is happening and what soldiers are actually experiencing on the front lines.
Yeah, it's clear they need to seriously rethink how they're managing this whole war effort.
For sure. And it's not just about manpower either. So France, they did deliver on their promises, right? They provided all the Caesar howitzers, armored vehicles, and anti-tank missiles they promised. But it seems like Ukraine, they failed to supply all the crucial drones and electronic warfare stuff that the 155th needed.
So it's like they had all the firepower, but no way to actually target it effectively?
Yeah. And I mean, Caesar howitzers, they're amazing for long-range attacks.
Yeah.
But they're not that useful if you don't know where to aim them.
Oh, that makes sense.
And if you can't jam enemy communications, you're basically a sitting duck.
Oof. Yeah, that's a bad combo. And then there's this whole culture of like not wanting to talk about problems.
Oh, yeah, that's never good.
So there was this internal report that initially labeled the 155th as unsatisfactory, but get this, someone changed it to satisfactory before they were sent to the front.
Seriously.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
I know, right? Talk about red flags. It makes you wonder about like the level of accountability and transparency within the Ukrainian military.
Big time. Like, if they're sweeping problems under the rug like that, how are they ever going to learn from their mistakes and get better?
Right. It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet when you've got a burst pipe in the basement. Ignoring those problems just makes everything worse in the long run.
Exactly. It just creates a bigger mess down the road.
And it's important to remember that this wasn't like the West dictating everything. Ukraine made all the decisions about the 155th, like the structure, how they'd use it, all of that.
That's right. This wasn't a case of the West calling the shots.
Jeffrey Edmonds, he's a former Pentagon official, and he basically said Ukraine was in control.
Yeah, which brings up this whole tricky issue of balancing support with autonomy,
Yeah, like how do you help without taking over?
Right, exactly. So the 155th's failure, it wasn't because of Western interference. It was a Ukrainian initiative. They planned and executed the whole thing. So the question is, did the pressure to prove themselves, to show they were worthy of all this Western support, did that lead to some major oversights?
That's a good question. So we've got this very expensive failure, some pretty serious issues within the Ukrainian military, and this whole delicate dance between getting support and staying in control. What does it all mean for the future of support for Ukraine? I mean, are other countries going to be hesitant to invest after seeing what happened with the 155th?
Right. Are they going to be less likely to help out?
Yeah. Is the 155th debacle going to make them think twice?
Well, that's where we need to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. And that's where the Swedish article comes in. It offers a really different perspective.
So the Swedish article, it kind of throws a wrench into everything we've been talking about. It challenges the whole narrative, like the one we hear all the time in the West, about unwavering support and guaranteed victory for Ukraine,
Yeah, it's like, hold on a sec, not so fast. It's not that simple. This article was written by Frida Strand, who's a peace and development researcher, and she's basically saying that just giving Ukraine tons of weapons, it doesn't automatically equal a win.
Okay, so she's not buying the whole more weapons equals victory thing. Interesting.
Right. She's arguing that this focus on a military solution, it could actually be making the war last longer and ultimately hurting Ukraine more in the long run.
Whoa, that's a pretty bold statement. So she's saying that all this military aid, it might not actually be the best strategy.
Exactly. Her argument is that if Ukraine prioritizes winning the war militarily above all else, they might end up losing even more territory and facing even more devastation than if they had negotiated earlier.
That's a really sobering thought. Makes you wonder if the West's obsession with military aid is really about helping Ukraine, or if it's more about, their own interests.
It's a valid question for sure. And when you look at what happened with the 155th, it becomes even more important. Like, if Western countries are now hesitant to help out after this whole debacle, doesn't that kind of show a lack of commitment to actually seeing this through with Ukraine?
That's a good point. So are we actually seeing any signs that countries are pulling back their support? I mean, is anyone getting cold feet after the 155th?
Well, the U.S. and Germany, they've pledged to create new brigades, but the timelines are super vague. Like, who knows when that'll actually happen? And France, well, they seem pretty hesitant to commit to a second brigade after the whole 155th mess.
Yeah, I can't say I blame them. It does sound like the 155th has made people rethink things a bit.
Yeah, it's definitely given some countries pause.
So does this mean that support for Ukraine is drying up?
Not necessarily, but it definitely highlights the need for a more nuanced approach, just throwing money and weapons at the problem. That's clearly not working. We need to be smarter about this.
Right. It's not just about how much you give. It's about what you give and how you give it. This is where things get really tricky, though. How do you balance the need to help Ukraine immediately with the fact that their military is facing some serious internal issues?
It's like a puzzle with a million pieces, right? There are no easy answers here, that's for sure. I think one thing that's absolutely essential is open and honest communication between Ukraine and its allies. They need to be able to talk frankly about what's working and what's not.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to acknowledge the problems, learn from the mistakes of the 150th, and find more effective ways to support Ukraine without, dictating their strategy or treating them like they can't make their own decisions.
Exactly. It can't just be, here's a bunch of weapons, do what you want with them. It has to be a real partnership,
Yeah, like a two-way street.
Exactly. So it's about finding that sweet spot between providing support and empowering Ukraine to make its own choices and figure out its own path.
It's a tough balancing act for sure. You can't just ignore the problems in the Ukrainian military, but you also can't treat them like they don't know what they're doing, you know?
Totally. And that's why it's so important to listen to the voices of people like Nick. He's on the front lines, seeing everything firsthand.
And he actually said that despite all the challenges, he's starting to see this sense of brotherhood forming within the 155th.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
I know, right? Like a glimmer of hope amidst all the chaos.
It's incredible, isn't it? It really shows you the power of the human spirit, even in the face of just terrible adversity, like people finding ways to connect and support each other, even when everything seems to be falling apart around them.
It's inspiring for sure. So I think what we've learned today, it's not just about one failed brigade. It's about so much more than that. It's about how complicated war really is, the difficulties of navigating alliances, and the human cost that we don't always see in the news.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that there's no simple solutions here, and that supporting a country at war, it's not just about good intentions. It's about careful planning, strategic thinking, and being willing to adapt when things change.
Right, because things change all the time in war, especially in a war like this one.
Exactly. And maybe the most important thing is to listen to the people who are actually experiencing the conflict, to hear their stories and understand their perspectives, because that's how we'll learn the most valuable lessons.
I feel like we've uncovered way more questions than answers today.
Well, that's kind of how it goes when you really dive into something this complex, It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. There's always another layer underneath.
Yeah, and sometimes those layers make you cry.
Uh-huh, exactly. But those tears are a sign that you're actually learning something. You're confronting the hard truths and challenging your own assumptions.
Okay, so let's circle back to the whole Ukrainian autonomy thing. If giving Ukraine the freedom to make their own decisions was so important for getting Western support, what lessons should we learn from the 155th? How can we make sure future aid is more effective without, stepping on their toes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there's an easy answer. It's not like a one-size-fits-all solution. But the 155th, it definitely shows us that just throwing resources at a problem, it doesn't work. Especially if you're not addressing the root causes or having those really honest conversations with the people you're trying to help.
Yeah, it's like a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. It can backfire big time.
So it sounds like we need a more collaborative approach, one that recognizes both the strengths and weaknesses of the Ukrainian military and allows for, honest feedback and adjustments along the way.
That's it. It can't just be a one-way street.
Right. It has to be a true partnership.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between supporting Ukraine and empowering them to figure things out for themselves,
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It reminds me that war is so much more than just what happens on the battlefield. It's about alliances, politics, logistics, and all these human stories that we don't always hear about.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that there's always more than one perspective. So I encourage everyone listening, check out the full articles we talked about today, explore these different viewpoints and see what you think.
Yeah, we just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to discover, and I'm sure you'll find some really thought-provoking stuff as you dig deeper.
So we've talked a lot about the 155th, the challenges they faced, and the wider implications for the war in Ukraine. But we're left with this big question. Can Ukraine win this war just relying on Western military aid? Or does real victory require something more complex and multifaceted?
That's a really good question, and one that I think we'll continue to grapple with as this conflict evolves.
Absolutely. This war is far from over, and there are no easy answers. But by engaging in these tough conversations, by challenging our assumptions and seeking out diverse perspectives, we can hopefully contribute to a more informed and nuanced understanding of this incredibly complex situation.
Well said. Until next time, keep those questions coming and never stop learning.